Welcome to another episode of Island Connections.
Today we have in the car Professor Monisha Das Gupta, and she'll be talking to us a little bit about her life and her new research projects.
Stay tuned.
How are you guys doing?
Good. How are you?
Good. All right. So, Monisha, welcome to the show. First off,
Welcome to the car.
Yeah, welcome to the car. Welcome to the car / the show. It's good to have you with us. I was just wondering if you can start us off a little bit. Just tell us a little bit about yourself. You know, you've been at Mānoa for a while, but this is your first time with us in the car.
That is true.
Yeah.
This is the first time with our new team and the new version of Island Connections. So super excited. And the car also is very, very impressive. So it has been over 20 years that I've been at UH. And, I grew up in Kolkata, India. It's a huge city. If you take the whole metropolitan area, it's about 50 million people. I did my undergraduate, all my education up to my undergraduate in Kolkata. And my experiences there, have really, profoundly shaped what I care about and what I bring to ethnic studies.
Well, can you talk a little bit more about that? So what was it in particular?
Yeah, sure. For one, I was very young, but I was a witness to the liberation war that created Bangladesh. So that was in 1971, and I remember the blackouts, and I remember the warplanes like whizzing over our heads, when we were very, very small. We also sort of realized that Bangladeshis were kind of fighting for their liberation, for their language liberation, the right to speak their language, the right for self-determination. At a very young age, that was quite a message to sort of absorb. And for those of you who don't know, so Bangladesh was East Pakistan, and there was a lot of political tension in that formation of East Pakistan. So India got separated, and there was East Pakistan and West Pakistan. The conflict resolved in a way that India defended the Bangladeshi liberation warriors, and eventually it led to the independence of Bangladesh. We also grew up with, sort of an awareness of the war in Vietnam. From 1977 onward, we lived in a good way, under a Communist Party Marxist government. And even though I went to a very sheltered school and a very sheltered college, words like class struggle, intelligentsia, bourgeoisie, which we were a part of, the idea of a public good, these were kind of just in the air, and we just absorbed it. They were totally normalized. And I remember when I first came to the US, people had this terrified look on their face when we talked about communism, and I didn't know communism was a bad word. So yeah.
Wait, so when was that when you came to the US?
I came to the US like for my graduate work twice. So I wasn't a kind of person who went from undergraduate straight onto graduate school. I hated school.
What?
I mean, I loved school, but I really didn't want to be in school. Okay, let me reframe it. I hated, this idea that we would have to sort of keep, going to university and succeeding. My parents were academics, and that was not something that I saw for myself. So I got a job as a journalist in a relatively new newspaper, an English language newspaper. And I was first assigned to the copy editing desk and had to work odd hours. But that newspaper was, number one, it was, the editor was this Muslim intellectual who was looking for a young audience to fire up. And we were a very, very young crowd too at the news desk. That was also the first sort of mixed gender workplace or environment in which I was exposed to. I went to an all-girls school and all-women's college, and I very soon became very aware of sexism in the profession. And when I was asked to go on beats, which was kind of special for people who worked at the desk, I was assigned sort of very feminized topics. So write about fashion, which I was the least interested in. Or I remember I was sent out to do a story on a woman who made wigs. So there was definitely I was chafing in some ways against that kind of culture of sexism and wanted to do something else. My sister had left, she's younger to me by 5 years, and she had left for the US a while back, and she went to Smith College in Massachusetts, and she told me about this program in American Studies, and she said, hey, it's a graduate program, why don't you just come and spend a year? It was a really great experience. My professor there, Peter I. Rose, was really grounded us in immigration history, refugee policies, and I think that that's part of why I really became so interested in immigration.
Smith College?
At Smith College, yeah. Again, an all-women's college that I really enjoyed. Really enjoyed being there, but at the same time, there were so many aspects of the United States that I did not like, and a lot of it was this sort of rampant individualism that I couldn't deal with. So after my program ended, I went back for a year, and you will be astonished to learn that I actually worked for the cultural imperialist arm of the United States, the American Center, for a year, and actually I saved up money. I quit my job at the Telegraph, which was the newspaper at which I worked, and it was a very different experience, and one of the formative experiences there was the Gulf War in 1990. There was a huge number of folks who turned up outside of the American Center to protest, America policing the world. Imperialism was something that was just in the air for us. Like, we knew somehow intuitively what imperialism was because of the political discourse around which I grew up. It was, these folks were assembled, they were peacefully protesting the war, the US involvement, like immediate sort of deployment of ground troops. And our Kolkata municipal police were deployed to, beat them up, and I saw people's skulls being cracked. And it was quite a horrific experience for me, which also sort of, I would say, politicized me to see the ways in which the U.S. operates in other parts of the world.
So are we going to morning brew? We're going to morning brew. I want to ask my question.
Why don't I get our orders?
Oh, you got the orders this
I
time.
get the orders.
Okay.
Or you want to ask your question?
I mean, it's up to you. You can get the orders, or I
I'll
can
get the orders.
I feel like I always get the orders, so I don't mind. So
I'll
okay.
get the orders. And then you can talk with Monisha.
Yes, that works. Yeah. And it's really interesting hearing about your life before professor, because I didn't know any of that. Quite honestly, because going from the newsroom to also thinking about your childhood, it also gets me wondering, how does that have an influence on, what you've brought with you to Hawaii, Mānoa, and in particular in ethnic studies?
Yeah, sure. I think that when I teach about third world solidarity, like I feel like I really experienced it because of, our attention to the ways in which the U.S. was waging this war. And what I learned later on was not just Vietnam, but Southeast Asia. Or when we saw images of the democratization movement in South Korea, we were also in India, very visibly in the media, outright supporters of Palestinian self-determination. So these things really shaped me without my knowing that it was these world events were shaping me, So for me, it was coming here and having a language to talk about that and, realize, reflecting back, oh, this is really what was going on, and this is why, our governments were positioned this way, and the political stances that they took sort of signaled a kind of alternative, nationalist politics, of course. But at the same time being very aware of the sexism that was embedded in, sort of Marxist politics and, left-leaning spaces in Kolkata, and, sort of seeing it also manifest in workplaces.
Yeah, definitely. And it almost makes me wonder then, right, because as it's manifesting through this lived experience, but also it feels that you're able to connect the dots between what folks are studying, but also having that firsthand account and knowledge of how it's happening on the ground, or how that translates, from this historic to the experiential.
For sure. Yeah. And I think that, again, the feminism helped me connect the two. That lived experience is very much, a part of both our intellectual projects as well as our political projects. So again, I felt like I had all these pieces in my head, but then when I went into graduate school, so I returned to Kolkata for a year, worked for the American Center, and then I was admitted into the sociology program at Brandeis University, which was a good fit for me in some ways. It was a heavily, qualitative department. So we did qualitative sociology, had a disdain for quantitative sociology, but we didn't have Asian American studies. We self-taught. Basically we were self-taught in terms of Black and third world feminisms. So it was exciting because we did it with our peers as well as undergraduates that I had met. I sort of very quickly formed a very radical and loving community of women of color, where we were passing around this bridge called our back, and sort of reading things out to each other, these essays and poetry, and kind of at that moment feeling like, oh, I had a framework, I had words, I had concepts to translate the lived experience into something that was not just unique to me, but said something about the world.
And it sounds like it's such an organic process that you're coming to forming those connections too, especially within grad school when a lot of these sort of discussions were present, but the departments that we now have weren't necessarily there in the same kind of way.
Yes.
Which I think our students take for granted in a certain way,
Which is in some ways really good. But I don't know about your experience, but there was no such space. I mean, we basically gravitated toward Gary Okihiro, for example, and read everything that he wrote, because again, it brought to life, the issues that we were sort of witnessing in the United States as immigrants, or one of, I mentioned this bridge called My Back, or Gloria Anzaldua's work, but we also had Making Waves, right? We were carrying that around with us kind of as a talisman, it's like, oh, this is something that is reflective of immigrants, of what immigrants go through, especially women, and this is the articulation of Asian American feminism in these pages. So I thought that was really powerful.
Yeah, definitely. You've mentioned immigrant multiple times, so I'm wondering if there's a way we can segue into talking about unruly immigrants. And what you're talking about when it comes to grad school, the sort of organic process of combining the lived experience, the theoretical, being in a sociology department that's absent of Asian American studies and others. How does that get you into the sort of research that you started doing, but also to ultimately unruly immigrants being your first book? When I I wouldn't say migrated, when I came here for my graduate studies, one of the things that I very quickly realized, especially once I was at Brandeis, when I started to be much more conscious of the sort of legal regimes that we as international students had to encounter, I became my identity was very much an immigrant woman of color, and the awesome community that I was talking to you about, a lot of us were immigrant women, some from South Asia, others from the Caribbean, and we started to sort of really talk about what it meant to live as an immigrant in the United States. Also, when I was at Smith College, my first research project, which became a Gender and Society article called What's Indian About You, was based on fieldwork that I did. I used to commute from Northampton to New York City to do my fieldwork, and basically found people in the phone book and asked them if they wanted to talk about their experiences.
This is a back in the day kind of
back in the day kind of thing, and the phone book was huge, and there were lots of rude people who said no thank you. And
there wasn't sending out emails.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah, there was no email. Wow. Well, yeah, no. So that was kind of my first dipping my toes into ethnography in the immigrant community, but that first project was still framed around questions around cultural identity. It was about 4 second-generation women whose stories really stuck with me, and I talk about the ways in which the what makes you Indian is deeply gendered and deeply accompanied by sexual policing. So that sort of was a formative experience, and then I went on to graduate work, and I was going to go back to India and do field work on reproductive rights, reproductive justice, and at the same time the South Asian immigrant women that I was talking to you about, we started our own group, South Asian Women in Actions, SAWA, in Boston, and were immediately sort of drawn into trying to provide support and create some kind of grassroots infrastructure to support women who were in domestic violence situations. Where Boston, these women often lived in the suburbs where they were extremely isolated. They were cut off from any kind of public transportation. And this was also around the time when Sakhi in New York, which is, today it defines itself as an anti-gender violence organization. At that time, it was focused on domestic violence. And of course, Mānoaʻs, which was based in New Jersey, had started. So we were in conversation with them as well. And I remember like one night we were all like sitting together in sort of graduate student living room, like if you can imagine, like the kind of grime and like the furniture from the dumpsters. But we were all like talking passionately, and several of my friends, including Rich, who shared the apartment with us, was like, hey, why can't this be your dissertation topic? And I was like, can it? And it took me a while to, sort of figure that out. And that research then went on to become Unruly Immigrants. And I think that one of the, I would say, field shifting things that I did is, especially in South Asian American studies, was, to really look at ourselves as people with a political identity, and political not in the sense of electoral politics, but engaging with social justice issues. So I remember when I proposed my dissertation topic, and throughout my dissertation research, when I said, I want to write about these SAWOs, which are like South Asian women's organizations. I want to write about queer organizing that I'm seeing happening at the same time, and labor organizing. Several of my committee members did not support that and said I was trying to do too much. It didn't make sense. My dissertation wasn't cohering in their head. And I remember in 1996, when taxi drivers went on strike, a historic strike, then I was getting New York Times cuttings in my mailbox telling me, hey, did you know about these taxi drivers who are now organizing? The people who supported me in the research was my community of activists, and who said that this is really important. I think that, again, though that research came out of a lot of long-term relationships, going to these different places, my own involvement in SAWA, because SAWA is featured in the chapter on women's organizations, and, really understanding labor struggles, through a feminist lens, because Bhairavi Desai at that time was the executive director of NYTWA. I also learned that there can be a lot of fractures and fission, within this kind of organizing space, and, figuring out like, how do you write about it, both in consultation with the organizations, but also, sort of putting across this idea that it's not because South Asians are a particularly querulous group, which is kind of the explanation. It's because we are bringing so many intersecting parts of our identity to the movement. There was a split of the domestic workers from Sakhi, which was very painful. And the domestic workers felt like their issues were very particular, and it required a separate organizing space, for example.
How did you decide what to include as part of the dissertation and eventually the book? There's a wide range of things, right?
Yeah, I just went for the whole thing. I was undeterred by people's criticisms, my committee members' lack of confidence in the topic. I kind of felt like, because a lot of these spaces were also overlapping, so queer spaces in the Boston area, we did a lot of programming with each other, so it felt that there was a lot of overlap. And we had members from Masala, which was the queer group, in Sawa, and Sawa members in Masala. So it was kind of, it's felt like we needed to sort of talk. I needed to talk about it together. My dissertation is very different from the book because I organized the dissertation thematically, and I remember sitting at feminist Becky Thompson's place. Becky had also gone to Brandeis and really supported me in my work. By that time she was full-time faculty, tenured, I believe. So I was sitting at her fireplace, and we just took the pages of my dissertation apart, and she said, Monisha, I think what you need to do is write about each type of organizing separately, and those would be your chapters. And I'm really grateful for that kind of mentorship that I have received. And I've received a lot of mentorship from feminists, especially feminists of color, Linda Carty, for example. And I feel like that's something that I want to do for others who are entering perhaps a different intellectual political space in the academy, but still need a lot of support.
Mm-hmm. How does, and I'm thinking about the way that you're coming about this previous book, how does that compare to the context and also the sort of direction you took your newest work?
Right. So I think the writing that book convinced me that I can write about social movements, not as a sociologist, but as a person situated in ethnic studies and women, gender, and sexuality studies. And I think that, Rod, having been trained in anthropology and having had Karen Brodkin as your mentor, I think that, it's hard, like our disciplinary training embeds us in certain kinds of theories, and if we don't write about social movement theory in sociology, then we are not speaking the language. And I just felt like much of the organizing that I was studying didn't exactly fit into that. So I felt like there was a way to write about the movement making in ethnic studies. And since then I have since that book, I have committed myself to writing about social movements, and it's kind of Rod and I have talked about it. It always seems like a snapshot. Like all you can do is a snapshot of a particular moment or a particular kind of energy, and then it changes, right? So in many ways, our books are much more static than social movements are.
Yeah. Are there differences, like in terms of even like data gathering methodology kinds of stuff?
Oh yeah.
Just now having email.
Yes.
And not clippings.
Yes.
Not clippings.
Yeah. I mean, the biggest difference was having an ocean between where I live and where I do my fieldwork. And with the World Wide Web and email and all of that, many people do study social movements by through social media now, but at that time even what would appear on websites, right? And when I was doing the research for this book, before I kind of went into the field as such, I tried to track what these organizations were doing on their website, and it just felt like I really didn't understand what was going on. And that was so true, because once I went to these places and I'm like, oh, I didn't understand a thing before I started talking to you, before I started to learn. So, I've kept that kind of ethnographic immersion that we were taught. I'm very, very, I feel like it's a really important method. What I've done differently perhaps in this book is also, I've looked very closely and at reports and other forms of knowledge that organizations themselves produce, and I have used those. So there, for example, Families for Freedom, an organization that I write about that's based in New York, and that does anti-deportation organizing, defending, quote unquote criminal aliens, right? People who have had, because they're people of color in New York City, have had many encounters with law enforcement and were either charged or put in prison and then put into deportation proceedings as a result of the 1996 laws. So, I haven't been able to spend much time with them, but, I was able to learn so much from their reports, from their trainings. Increasingly, like, we could do virtual trainings, and that benefited me from the work that I did here on anti-deportation organizing. Just knowing, for example, Families for Freedom has a report called Deportation 101. So, just to figure out, like, how do you stop this kind of state violence, which is in itself an intimidating project. When I went to Khmer Girls in Action, I really had to think about the category youth. As an adult in a youth space, they told me very clearly that I was going to be an observer. Mm-hmm. So it wasn't participant observation anymore, it was observation. And I think, I entered the field at a moment when the immigrant rights movement had spilled onto the streets. So I had the opportunity to really take part in a lot of public events and sort of weave that into my book as well, especially my, first experiences with direct action and civil disobedience.
Have you ever gotten pushback or criticism about being too close to what you're studying? Ooh. Too close to your subject?
We will see.
So even with your first book, how were the responses to that? Because I'm just thinking about in terms of at that time,
yes,
and you're already talking about folks not necessarily being supportive of your work. Was any of that criticism based off of because what you were doing, you were too close to what you were doing?
I know that is a very common kind of criticism that is leveled at the kind of work that we do. Thankfully, I went to a qualitative department, so that was less of a problem than the minimization of the kind of activism I was documenting, right? So I continuously came up against questions about, but who are these people? I mean, look at South Asians, like they're like, I think at that point, like a very small portion of a very small portion of Asian Americans in the entire, American, in like a small demographic, part of, the United States. And so I got that kind of pushback, like, why are you sort of studying this kind of like very small, marginal, groups who are not even like making that much of a difference.
Yeah, and then have this huge scope because you're doing intersectional thinking before it was really like
right? For sure. So I don't know whether this book will elicit those sorts of comments too close to my participants. I think that one difference between Unruly and this book is that while I was researching the book and writing parts of it, I actually naturalized as a U.S. citizen. And when I finished my first book, I was still I had just gotten permanent residency. And those sorts of encounters with, at that time, the INS and then, USCIS were very unpleasant. And I felt like I actually had a lot of privilege, especially toward the end of my field work. As a US citizen, I could do so many more things, and I had the freedom of movement. I couldn't even go to Canada when I was, sort of adjusting my status from an F1 to permanent residency, because you had to be paroled. You had to be look at this kind of criminalizing language. You have to be paroled before I could go to a conference in Canada, and I was like, that's just too much. I don't think I'm going to do that. Yeah. So we are at India Market, and I'm super excited about samosas, and I hope they have it.
Yeah.
What do you want?
What's up?
I can go in.
Okay.
No, I can. It's my treat.
No, but you're on camera.
Oh,
Whoa.
This is like the excitement of getting samosas at Indian store.
Rod's like, just get it.
Just eat.
Just get it already.
All right. I don't know whether we are on recording or
We're
not.
still recording.
Yeah,
It's red.
Okay.
it's still red.
The funniest story.
Wait, yeah, 'cause since both of your parents are academics, and then you were fighting against it. You're fighting against it. What then?
Whoa.
You became what you were fighting against.
Exactly. And you cannot imagine how much that rankles me.
Why?
I'm just like, how did I become them? Yeah, I really struggle with that piece, like how this trajectory worked out. And my dad was a very charismatic and extremely beloved professor, and I always felt like, oh, I can't be him. And I don't need to be him. My mom was also she taught in an institution that was more like ours, where folks who were, first generation learners, not necessarily economically privileged, coming and, trying to get a college education. So, and she was very, very dedicated to her students. So I saw all of that, but, academics, it's just, it still is.
That was your
kind of, it's kind of like, well, it's a good way to make a living. And it's a good job, especially when we are unionized.
Is that what it was? There had to be at some point where, so you were resisting it when you're doing your first degree.
Yeah.
But then you came back.
Yeah.
And you knew you had to have known that part of the end goal was
Yes.
it was going to be
some kind of an
Yes.
academic track.
Yes.
Yes, because you couldn't fail, and I couldn't go back to India. Not
No other way.
done what they were, what I was supposed to do, because that was my recurrent nightmare, right? Which was what if I don't make it? Because number one, within a year of my coming to graduate school, I'd gone to Brandeis to work with M. Jackie Alexander, who's a Black feminist, and she, under very unfortunate circumstances, aka racism, had to leave Brandeis. So I kind of felt like, oh, I don't have an advisor. I don't have anybody to work with, and it was such a huge deal for me to come abroad to study, because that meant that my parents were going to be by themselves. Who was going to, there were all these caretaking kinds of issues, big questions about, what was going to happen to my parents, what was I doing. Relatives said, we've heard of people going to America to, become scientists and, become physicists. We've never heard anybody going to America to do sociology.
So, you know, the pressure was intense, and so I had this kind of nightmarish sort of scenario where I'd be like, I have to pack my bags and go back home, and God knows what I will do. Oh my God, no, this can't happen. And so,
you have
and
skills already. You're a journalist. You can do copy editing.
yeah, well, I mean, I wasn't a good copy editor.
But it was skills that was already training you to become a professor.
Oh my God. Yeah, and you know, I mean, all of us, I think, were in this kind of job market where just landing a job like seemed like a Herculean task, and when you got it, you're like, okay, now I have to just sort of stick to this, do everything that I can to get tenure. Like this is about economic security.
How true, how true.
So I think, you know, I channeled that part of sort of the immigrant grit to stay in the academy. And I think that, you know, just coming to ethnic studies has been a very wonderful thing for me. Like the fit between ethnic studies and what I do and what I believe in is so great that I really, you know, feel that I can make a change by doing what I'm doing. You know, I myself had always gone to private schools. I'd never ever gone to public school. And now I just can't imagine myself in any other kind of, you know, space or teaching other kinds of students. So yeah, I think for me, finding ethnic studies and finding the colleagues who make up our department very, you know, sincerely has been transformative for me. I wouldn't want to be anywhere else.
I think we should just end there.
Yeah.
I mean, I think, honestly, I think that's such a great, like, mic drop moment of sorts.
But I do have a question though. It's 'cause, so then when you first got here, well, maybe two questions. So what got you to here, and where were you before? And then secondly, in the amount of time that you've been here, what has changed over that time?
Oh, yeah. I'm gonna try and hold those three pieces in my head. Rod, my first tenure track job was near a place where you've been,
I know.
except that Rochester is a much better town than Syracuse. I spent 3 years in Syracuse. I like to call it in a state of exile. It was right when 9/11 happened, and it was a terrible time to be in upstate New York. It was a terrible, terrible time. And the only thing that kept me going was that I was doing this, you know, sort of, I guess now we would call it participatory action research with taxi drivers to document the violence that they were facing after 9/11 and their access to FEMA aid. So, you know, just going back and forth and being plugged into the ways in which people were fighting back against this economic and racial injustice was, you know, kept me sane. And I think that, you know, there was a part of me where I was like, I need to find something else to do. And my partner, Rich, who's also an ethnic studies professor who's recently retired, you know, we were sort of doing the commuter thing. And it was really hard because I just lost my mother. My dad came to live with me. He had just hated being in the U.S. So it was a lot. And we were both on the job market. Rich got the job offer. He used to be in history. And I was invited by this awesome feminist who unfortunately is no longer at UH, but teaches at the University of Washington, Both Hill, Charu Sheila, invited me to give a job talk. And, you know, ethnic studies and WGSS really went to bat for me. I started off, this a lot of people don't know, I started off on a renewable year-to-year renewable arrangement under Dean Dubinovsky. And I did that for 3 years, and during those 3 years, Kathy Ferguson, who was the chair of WGSS at that time, Women's Studies, Dean Allegado, who was the chair of Ethnic Studies, and Karen Jolly, who was the chair of History, they all really, did a lot of work to, sort of conduct a national search so that I could get a regular tenure track position. So that was sort of my, the sort of formal kind of narrative of, what happened, why I stayed. But the other thing was, the moment I walked into ethnic studies and people were talking about Asian American studies, like it was just something that they breathed, in the air. Like it wasn't something out there. I didn't have to explain where South Asia was every time I did a talk. It was just so freeing for me, just to find a home where people understood my work and trusted me to do my work and supported me in my activism. I think I said that Dean Allegado took me to my first Unite Here Local 5 meeting. He encouraged me to sit on our union board, because he was on the union board, and he would go on the long Saturday, meetings at the union, and that was right after, faculty had struck. So there was that ferment, to do something about our labor conditions. So these things were just, astonishing to me. And I was like, wow, I'm in this kind of a department. Whoa, I really want to be here. And WGSS under Kathy's leadership was also a very vibrant, intellectually vibrant place, a very supportive place. So, that's how it began. However, when they take you around and dine you, I asked them, so do you have an Indian store? And nobody would answer that question because there was no Indian market. No. And everybody said, well, Jagdish Sharma and Mimi Sharma, they cook delicious food.
That was it.
That was it. And I was like, can I really survive in this place? I still really miss a vibrant South Asian community. I miss my progressive South Asian sisters. But, it's been like I had, this place has so many different, ethnic groups. I've learned so much about, oceanic culture and peoples and indigenous politics. So I guess that what, my work, this recent book could only be possible, I think, because I wrote it in Hawaii, where there is this, really, there's this uprising for Native Hawaiian sovereignty, and you can feel the air everywhere, like at the university, ringing through the mountains, when we go to work on Lois. It's a very different orientation, and I felt like this book gave me the chance to really tackle what does it mean to bring migration studies in conversation with Indigenous studies, and I think that could have been only possible because I was here.
So how's the department changed since when you first went to your first Unite Here
Oh my gosh.
meeting? But I think maybe I'll help you answer.
Yeah.
So part of it is the oceanic focus that you're talking about, right?
Yes.
But anything else?
Yeah, I mean, that conference that we had, I think was really game changing. It inserted like so many questions about how we can do ethnic studies from where we are in this ocean. I end the book, the conclusion of the book actually goes to that, sort of that exercise that Ty did with us as
he opened up the conference where he had us hold Senate cordage, which is used for navigation to tie pieces of the canoe and give it stability. And we all held it, each of us. I mean, it was a huge circle because there must have been over 100 people who were convened, and we all held it and made a commitment to be steady navigators, steering and voyaging the same choppy oceans. And I felt like that was such a fitting metaphor and practice for the ways in which we are dealing with these times that we are in. Like there have been so many social upheavals just in the last 2 decades that our department has really engaged with in very meaningful and substantive ways. So that, and the one thing that I always want to foster and cultivate and have continue in our department is our commitment to our communities, because I think that that's really the source of our strength.
Okay, so tell our viewers, what is your book?
Oh,
the title of the book.
The title of the book is All of Us or None, Migrant Organizing in an Era of Deportation and Dispossession. So I juxtapose deportation, which is removal, and dispossession, which is the continuous dispossession of indigenous people of their lands. And All of Us or None is this commitment that comes out of the activists who pay attention to criminalization, to not leaving anybody behind, especially those who are criminalized, those who are behind bars, those who are in detention centers, those who are at the border. So it's like this ethos that really is expansive and can imagine justice outside of these various, cages that we have built.
Okay, I think that does it. That wraps it up for this episode of Island Connection. Stay tuned next time for our next guest, and we look forward to seeing you folks then.
Make sure to read Monisha's book.
Yeah.
What is the name of the book again?
All of Us or None.
There we go. Cheers to that.
Cheers.
Yeah.
Thank you. This was
thank you.
delightful.